Okay. Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for coming. Thank you for taking time on one of the last glorious evenings of this summer to be here and to talk civics with us. My name is Brad Ross, and I serve the great city of Somerville as Director of Mobility in the Mayor's Community Development Office. I'm a Somerville resident. I'm a Somerville parent. My 3.5-year-old will start the SMILE program possibly in this very building a year from now. I've been a Somerville resident and public servant for about 12 years, and it's really always exciting to me to see the level of civic engagement and activism as we work to deliver on every area of public policy that our residents expect and deserve, supporting the wonderful renaissance in public education here, renewing our infrastructure, making sure that parks and public spaces are modern, are safe, are sustainable, and active for residents no matter what your age, what your ability. The team that I'm responsible for, I'll introduce you a couple of staff here who have joined us. We do all the transportation planning in the city of Somerville. So we're the point people on the Green Line extension, on bus service coordination, on walkability, bike safety. We do parks planning. So the wonderful schoolyard here at the Winter Hill is part of our team's work. We also do urban forestry. The city's 2 staff arborists are part of the team that sit with Justin and Courtney and I. So we're here tonight to talk about, clearly one of everybody's favorite and most challenging topics, which is mobility, which is parking around the high school project. This process has been ongoing through a couple generations of staff, and we're here now to continue that process with you all. So please allow me to introduce staff and some of our consultant team. And because we have a small group, it would probably be valuable for us to just kind of get names, where you live, the role. Are you an educator? Are you a resident? Are you an activist? I think it would be very helpful for us to kind of get that sense. So Justin, do you mind going first, please? Right. Pat? Okay, well, thanks, everybody. We appreciate that. There's one of the advantages of the small group setting is that we can be a little bit more informal and less formal. For kind of ground rules, I don't anticipate any challenges, but hey, these are legitimate challenges that our community is dealing with. There are legitimate trade-offs, parking impacts. We'd ask that as you tell your stories, as you represent your positions, your concerns, you ask us questions. Let's just do our best to keep the dialogue civil. Like I said, I'm not worried. We get, shall we say, pointed criticism and sometimes raised voices thrown at us for a living, but we will do our best to respect what you're telling us and to do our homework for kind of this ongoing process. It is an ongoing management challenge. The mayor often uses this kind of construction disruption. He uses the visual of like, this is 2015 snow emergency, 12 months a year for 3 years consecutively. Our city is renewing 50 years worth of infrastructure, all compressed into 5 years, and includes capital facilities like the high school. It includes streets, sewers, parks, and we are empathetic and respectful of the fact that it stinks to get around, that commutes are longer than they used to be, that noise, dust, and vibration and parking pressures are not what they were 5 years ago. So with that kind of ground rules of like empathy and awareness, I'll turn it over to the project team, Justin, who's managing things, and Liz from our consultant team. So thank you.
Thanks, Brad. All right. So here is our agenda for tonight. Although I'm sure many of you are very familiar, we're going to go over the project timeline and what the Central Hill campus is going to look like once the construction is complete of the high school. Liz is going to take us through the results of the parking study. We're going to talk about our RFP to lease off-site parking. We're going to talk about a potential alternative option to license off-street parking and the differences between those 2 approaches. We have a couple new parking options to share with you all and new options of getting around that aren't driving that we'd like to share with you all. And then finally, we'll end up with a few next steps. All right. So this is the revised timeline of the parking lots on Central Hill and when they went offline and when they will be going offline. We were able to get a couple extra months for the Medford Street parking area. And as of now, everything you see in blue is now offline. And the final parking lot that'll be going offline next June or approximately is the one off School Street. Question? For construction, it'll be closed. Yeah. So they've just set up this construction fence around these parking areas. Yep. And it took me a while to hunt this down. Thank you, Courtney, for helping me out with that. This is what it will look like once the construction of the high school is complete. So this is the plan that was approved by the ZBA a couple of years back. This doesn't include the next phase of the Central Hill planning. Doesn't include any sort of renewal of City Hall or the 1895 building. This is just at the end of 2021, once the high school construction is complete. And we've got the breakdown there below. Any questions on that before we move on? Great. And then this is the conceptual vision for the Central Hill Master Plan. So it includes what you just saw, plus renovation of the park spaces along Highland Avenue and potential renovation of City Hall in the 1895 building.
And I didn't mention that I'm the project manager
Yes.
for this part of the project work. So phase one is from the front of Memorial Hall towards Walnut Street, in front of the library. So replacing the playgrounds and reinstalling the Vietnam and Korean War memorials and a new memorial for all wars.
And some important pedestrian improvements to point out are curb extensions of the intersection of Medford and Walnut, as well as new mid-block crossings to make it significantly easier to get across Highland Avenue. And then you've got the Gilman Square Station sort of on the top of the image in the middle. Right. So the parking study. We had our initial parking study back in spring 2017 by Nelson Nygaard. We heard a lot of feedback from the community about that study, that it wasn't quite comprehensive enough. It really only looked at street sweeping conditions, not things like snow emergencies. So in response to those concerns, we contracted with Howard Stein Hudson to look at some of those other scenarios, like when there's snow on the ground, what happens after the snow emergency is over and there's still piles of snow at intersections, what happens in the phased reduction of parking on campus, and also looking at the morning turnover, that sort of high turnover area where residents are going to work or not quite going to work yet, and teachers are already arriving on campus as early as 7 a.m. And now I'll turn it over to Liz to talk about our parking study.
So Sarah has been helping out with this
Oh, yeah,
project.
Sarah.
She has walked every street of this
Pointer?
study area. So she's going to present the first bit of information, which many of you have already seen. So we'll go through that pretty quickly, and then I'll get into some of the new constraints information that we collected.
All right, so with that, once again, I'm Sarah Davis. So I'm just going to take us through some of the things a lot of you I know have been to the other meetings, but just kind of give you a little background. As we kind of went over the high school in the center here, and there's the parking lots there in orange. These are all the streets that we went and collected data on throughout the whole process. So we were able to kind of focus in more closely for some of our parking counts, and then went further out into some of the streets for the other ones. So have definitely spent a lot of time walking up and down all of these streets. As far as our data collection process went, we were walking down each street, looking at the permits that were on each car, counting the number that were in each curb segment. And we went out during the morning, the midday, and the evening, kind of corresponding with when people were arriving for school, so teachers and students, when people were leaving for work in the morning, kind of seeing that overlap. And then in the middle of the day, not seeing nearly as much movement. And then in the evening, kind of seeing how when people come home from work, their evening plans, and people are here maybe for events at the high school, seeing how those work together as well. So we went all different days throughout May of 2018, and we were able to collect some just regular conditions, some with street sweeping, some with special events. So these last two at the bottom, those were both special events at the high school in the evening. And then we also heard that Parents' Night was a big parking concern, so we were able to come out and collect on that night. And then in February, I was out here just seeing how the snow had affected the parking occupancy as well. So seeing how many spots were taken up by piles of snow, how many vehicles were still able to kind of fit in wherever they could, and seeing how that affected everything as well. So in addition to doing the full study area and counting all of those streets and kind of taking down information about the permits, we are also doing rapid counts to kind of see how cars turned over during those key times. So in the morning, like I said, when people are coming to school, there's a teachers trying to park while other people haven't quite left for work yet, as well as in the evening. So doing those quick 30-minute counts where we're just counting the vehicles. So those were just half-hour intervals, and we did them in the morning on those 3 days, some of which were street sweeping days, others of which were non-street sweeping days. And then in the evening, we were able to capture Parents' Night there in September, but also the Evening of Song in May of 2018. So taking that kind of into our results, we were able to put all that data together, map it out, kind of see where that led us. I know a lot of you have seen some of the data before, but looking at typical conditions, we were able to kind of put all of our occupancy into percentages, and when looking at this, you can kind of see a trend. Everything's around that 60 to 70%, never really going above 80%. Kind of the sweet spot is just below 85%, so not having way too much parking, that there's just parking everywhere, but also not having no parking and people are circling the block for hours and hours. So with that, we saw in the morning the most constrained day was that Monday, May 14th, which is what was actually a street sweeping morning, so it makes sense. We were losing about 300 parking spaces, so really had a little bit more pressure on the system that day. So that's when the teachers are coming and those people have not quite left for work yet. In the middle of the day, we didn't see nearly as much movement, so you can see just overall lower occupancies across the board. And then in the evening, seeing that highest occupancy on one of those evening events, so kind of corresponding with what we would have expected.
Okay, is this average across the whole, the data?
Correct, yeah. So this isn't street by street, this is average across the full system.
And I think we actually talked about this at the last meeting too, that we are summarizing based on the full study area, but we do recognize that there are certain areas that are more concentrated with that density of parking, like certainly around the campus itself. People are parking at the northern end of Putnam and not so much at the southern end. So we do recognize that first.
What's the radius? I thought I could go.
I have the study area right here. So we went decently far out, but still like within a 10-minute walk or so of the school.
Within a mile?
It was less than a mile, correct?
Yeah. In each direction.
You go back to
The study area?
one more back, just the table.
This? Yeah.
Yeah, something to note is that the 70% there on May 14th, that's a street sweeping day. And the other morning occupancies are non-street sweeping days. So we don't usually see like a doubling of occupancy on a street sweeping day that's gone up. But that suggests that people sort of spreading out over a larger area rather than trying to park in the same area just on the other side of the street.
So kind of to follow up on where the concentrations of higher occupancy might be, we kind of highlighted them here with these two circles. So I know this map is kind of a little bit harder to see from further out, but any of these purple and blue lines, those are showing either 85% to 100% capacity, or the purple ones are over 100% capacity. When we are calculating those occupancy numbers and the total number of parking spaces, we are very conservative in that calculation. So this is maybe like 1 or 2 vehicles if it is over that 100%, but just like I said, we are very conservative when we made those estimates. And as far as the trends went, we never, like I said, had 80% occupancy for the entire, or over 80% occupancy for the entire study area, but there were certain streets that we saw higher occupancy on. So anywhere closer to the school, which makes sense with what you would expect. And then the two areas highlighted, the northwest and the southeast, that's where you're going to see more of those blue and purple streets where they're over that 85% sweet spot. So kind of carrying that forward, we did those rapid counts as well, those 30-minute counts. And you can kind of see how it changes just from 7:30 to 8 and then 8:30. This day, that May 14th, is where we had that street sweeping day and we saw that 70% number in the morning. So seeing that kind of climb as you get to that 8:30 point where maybe people haven't left yet and they're just getting out the door. So seeing the most pressure there.
Question before you did. Can you go back to the last slide?
Yeah.
This is actually probably the, it didn't occur to me just now. When
Short answer to this is yes.
Okay, so I was wondering how we're going to get from the other side of the bridge, since we can't walk Medford.
The temporary bridge that the previous three-line contractor built will remain open for pedestrian. We've advocated for that, and that's baked in now.
No, it's okay.
It'll go away eventually, but during that pressure point that you're describing, yes, it'll stay open.
One more question.
Yeah, I was just curious how the study area was chosen. Like how did you determine that was an appropriate distance for this?
So those are the two zones that the city hall and school permit has. We don't have that designated.
And that was in the circle area, or
The
the whole thing?
whole study area, there's two zones, one and two. One and two can either compartment all the materials. There's two separate zones. So those are the sign zones.
Thank you.
All right. So with that.
Some people could be parking in the back.
So with that, I'm going to pass it off to Liz, and she's going to talk about some of those more constrained conditions where we had the street sweeping, evening events, things like that. If you want this, the button is right there, and it points out that.
So thank you for going through those typical conditions with us. I know some of you have seen them before. So as we mentioned before, the key purpose of our study was to look at some of these more constrained conditions and really get an understanding of how they're impacting the typical conditions. So this is the street sweeping map for the study area. And there's 3 different zones. So the arterials of Highland Ave, School Street, and Medford Street, those are zone 3. And those are cleaned once to twice weekly. And then zones 1 and 2, so this is zone 1 on the west and zone 2 on the east. Those are cleaned once a week on alternating days of the week. So what we did, we had calculated what the supply of parking was within the whole study area, and based on that, we were able to estimate the temporary reduction of spaces during these regulated times. So during zone 1, you would see a reduction temporarily of 267 spaces. In zone 2, 316 spaces. And one of the things that we noticed as we were doing the data collection and looking at the street sweeping zones is that on certain days you have overlapping street sweeping zones, but not on others. So for instance, on the 2nd and 4th Monday of the month, you have your zone 2 street sweeping, but you also have Highland Ave. So they're at different times. So from midnight until 6 a.m., Highland Ave is regulated. And then 2 hours later, zone 2, which is this area, is regulated from 8 a.m. until noon. So while they don't actually overlap, there are certainly many people who have to anticipate and park in line with both of those regulations. So to go back again, Mondays, the 2nd and 4th, that's what we saw were most impacted by that street sweeping schedule. So we did collect information on 2 typical evening events, but then we also did the rapid counts for the Evening of Song, which was in May of 2018, and Parents' Night, which was in September. So you can see that for the Evening of Song, this is a typical event. We do see occupancy go up during the event itself. That's about 6:45 p.m. So people are still probably, at work, maybe leaving school, coming for the event, arriving back home. So there's a lot going on. But we're below 80%. It's at 71% occupancy for that rapid collection area right around the school campus. However, on Parents' Night, which we were told was probably kind of the biggest event that is seen annually at the campus, the concentrated area around the campus reached capacity. So definitely, when there is a major event, the parking system is seeing quite a bit of pressure, as you can see, during the event, and then it drops off again at 8 p.m. back down to a pretty normal level of occupancy.
And all of this was taken not taking into consideration that was with still free teacher parking and public library parking.
Yes, so this was, Parents' Night was collected in September of this year.
Right. But
Yes.
saying that all of these numbers
so we're gonna get into that. Yep.
September of last year.
Yes, not next month. Yeah.
If you want to do it again, it's the same thing.
All right, so we were also asked to look at snow emergency conditions. So we went out 2 days after and 3 days after a snow emergency, which was right at the beginning of March. The snow emergency itself was, I think, March 3rd. So this table looks at the average midday condition, 61% occupancy. When we went out and did our counts 2 days after the snow emergency, we saw a reduction of spaces available due to snow of 150. So those are taken out of the supply. And we also counted the cars that were in the study area during that time that we were doing the counts. And we still came up with 61% occupancy. The next day we went out again, and the number of spaces had gone down to 125 that were unavailable due to snow. And we saw an occupancy rate of 59%. And so this goes back to what Justin was just talking about, that there is permeability between the study area and the adjacent neighborhoods. So as you get further out from the campus, as there is more pressure on the system, people who live further away are shifting to other neighborhoods, which makes sense. And so it seems like there's kind of an ideal occupancy that people are used to or used to feeling, or if it's higher than that, they're going to look for parking elsewhere. And so it's self-adjusted down to 61%. And given the number of spaces that were reduced, it's a pretty moderate number given the entire size of the study area. So now we're going to get into the construction impacts. And I think we did go over this last time that we spoke, but thinking about it kind of with all the other constraining conditions as well. So this map is just an example of one of the iterations that we did of this analysis. And what we wanted to understand was, with the different phases of construction, can the on-street parking system absorb that off-street parking as different lots are closed? And then in further phases, some will be reopened. So this is looking at the post-construction condition. What we did was we took our highest demand during the midday that we observed, so that's our demand, and then we adjusted our supply to reflect the construction conditions. So in this iteration, the parking lot off of School Street is being closed for the construction, and we were able to reallocate that parking in these blue highlighted sections. And the way that we did that was, first of all, we looked at a walking distance from the center of campus, and that's what this buffer is. So we didn't want anyone who used to park on campus to have to walk further than 5 minutes to get to campus. The other thing that we did was we never allocated vehicles to a segment to exceed 85%. So we want to keep that sweet spot where there's always a space or two available on every street so that people can find parking and they're not circling. So with that in mind, we were able to reallocate the number of people who were parking in that lot into the street system. But we will get into some summary of that. So with the construction impacts, we wanted to look at what are the existing conditions, what will be the typical conditions in that post-construction world, and then what are the conditions when parking is constrained due to either an event or street sweeping or a snow emergency. So in the morning, again, 70% was the study area-wide occupancy. In the typical condition for post-construction, 73. And then in that kind of worst-case scenario of the overlapping street sweeping, that's where we would see potentially up to 92%. But again, I think it's important to remember that people are dispersing on the outer edges of the study area, so likely that number would be lower because people aren't going to keep kind of piling in. There will be some dispersal, but it will be challenging to find parking, directly around the campus, I think it's safe to say.
In your projections,
Yeah.
have you factored in any other city work other than construction of the high school? For example, Prescott is all dug up and so on.
Mm-hmm.
There's also a tree removal, so that eliminates 25 spaces
Mm-hmm.
in that critical area. And, we're doing a lot of work. There's going to be a lot of impacts from a lot of different projects.
Yeah.
Separate from high school.
Yeah, so we did not take into account other construction projects that were going on, just given the timeline of the project. But I will say, we were talking about like how many spaces, if you reduce 20 spaces, we actually did that calculation, and that results in about a 1% increase in occupancy. So you wouldn't see, for some of the smaller projects, they'll impact the street that it's happening on, but system-wide, you're not going to see a ton of impact. But yeah, we were not able to take that into account. So we looked at morning, during the midday, generally lower occupancy, 66 is the existing condition. Post-construction, we go up to 70, and then again, midday with some sort of constrained street sweeping or snow emergency condition, as high as 89%. And then finally, in the evening, and evenings had the highest occupancy overall, just typically, because there's so much happening in the evening hours. It goes from 79 and then all the way up to 92 as a highest potential occupancy in a constrained condition. So we didn't end up talking this presentation much about the permits that we observed, but I do think it's worth pointing out that we observed very little spillover from when we did the counts of campus permits going into the on-street network. So we didn't really observe many city staff, non-residential, or high school permits beyond the campus when we did the counts. So that means that the campus parking is fairly concentrated. I mentioned before that the second and fourth Mondays are the most impacted by street sweeping, and that's what we've been basing all of this morning analysis off, is this like most constrained condition. So that's the absolute worst case. Evenings have the highest occupancy generally. The parking system can handle those typical events, so Evening of Song, the Highlander Awards, some of those other school events. But a parents' night is going to cause, constraints on the system, definitely.
How many typical events will there be? How many major events will there be?
I think I would defer to someone from the city on that.
So the parents' night is the biggest one.
Yeah.
Okay, that's, I'm sort of putting that in a major category. How many other nights are in that major category?
Typical events are
So, happening every week?
most probably about the probably like the second.
I will have this year's school schedule soon, I think I sent it to you last year. And then I'll try to do what I did last year for Mike, and I'll do it to you, where I highlighted every event that was taking place after 4 o'clock in the evening. And last year it ended up being about, it wasn't parents' night, but they were not counting athletic events, which is a big problem. But there were 52 events on the calendar to take place after 4 o'clock, not counting sports. So it was a lot. But I don't have that schedule yet, but I will.
And then we also, Lisa, thank you, because yeah, as we mentioned, this is not the process. We will have homework assignments, and you will expect additional follow-up from us. So this is going to be an information source for our team that we will work on. And we know it'll change year to year. It could also influence some next part of our discussions, strategies.
Okay. Yeah, I just have 2 more bullets, which are that the construction impacts, again, we're seeing that the on-street parking system can absorb that, except on the major events or the very constrained condition days. And so with all of this in mind, it suggested to us that the mitigation efforts should really focus on the campus users to minimize impact to residents, because the parking system is able to handle the typical residential parking. And really focus on turnover in the evenings. There's also some commercial areas, so on Highland and on Medford, so that's kind of adding to people coming to that area to go to restaurants and whatever, so efforts to encourage turnover there could also help free up some parking. So I think Justin is going to go over some options.
Thanks. All right. So when we last spoke, you heard about how we were going out with an RFP to lease off-site parking. It was released in late April, and it was later extended for a few weeks into June. Unfortunately, we only received 2 responses from a single entity. We're offering 25 spaces for about a little more than $100,000 per year. So this is, yeah, that's market price maybe in Kendall Square. It's well above market price in this area and far more expensive than we initially envisioned, and fewer spaces than we thought would be proposed. So those responses were rejected, and we're currently actively pursuing license agreements. The difference between the license and the lease agreements is that for a license agreement, the city doesn't have an interest in someone else's real estate. Like when you rent from your landlord, you have an interest in that apartment. You know, you can tell your landlord you can't come in during these hours. When you license something, it's kind of like buying a ticket for a ball game. It's a temporary license to do something or use something. And the procurement process differs a little bit. There's more opportunity for the city to be able to negotiate. We don't have to go out for an RFP. The challenge with that is the fact that there are simply limited sites close to the Central Hill campus. There are not that many places where on-street parking or off-street parking is available to lease. But we're actively pursuing those agreements. We hope to be able to share some more info about that soon. And that's where we're at right now with leasing off-site parking. Any questions about that?
Sorry, with that?
Yep.
Well, actually, day to day and hour to hour, Justin and I and others are working on this issue, and we actually have a couple of irons in the fire, so to speak. So, it's not stuff that we were able to kind of tie up in a bow to bring to the public tonight, but we are advancing the process and look at more specifics.
Right.
Is it ideal? No. Is it perfectly located? No. There will be some of these kind of trade-offs, because as Justin said, like, we all know the surface lots in the neighborhoods. You imagine this one, that one, like, oh, that's still a 10-minute walk from the library, still a 10-minute walk from City Hall to high school.
Right.
But we're trying to leave no stone unturned, knock on doors, respond to demands, and try to negotiate with the city to make it best interest.
Good question.
Yeah, you said 100,000 is way more than you anticipated. What were you envisioning? 'Cause I just roughly, I mean, it felt like numbers, I don't know.
Somewhere between $100 and $200 per space per month. It really varies widely by property owner. You know, I just know that in my work for Cambridge, $250 is like a Kendall Square parking spot. Somerville may be sort of creeping towards that, but we're not quite there now. Yes.
A while ago, Councilor Rossetti mentioned the place behind the Highlander restaurant here, the parking.
Highlander
Anything
Restaurant.
gonna come with that?
That's been one of the ones we've been talking to, Natalie, and we haven't been able to get them to give us a firm offer, but again, we've been in touch with them as recently as this week.
Okay, I went into the database, the assessment database, because it's connected to the 265 Medford Street, but I don't know who owns that business building. Do you know who owns it?
We know where it's the parking lot, yep, and again, there have been conversations, and we haven't been able to get them to kind of rise to the occasion.
Yeah, I mean, I saw the names on the parking lot, and I'm positive the people's names on the parking lot are not in that building anymore. I gotta get that off my chest. This is just sitting there for years, empty. And
Okay.
whatever you gave them should make somebody happy. Half those businesses are not in that building. Yeah. Sorry.
No, thank
but
you.
Seriously, it is so frustrating. So a couple times this week, Justin and I have been out on overnight shifts painting lane lines on Central Broadway in Lincoln Hill, trying to make the streets safer. And so literally, there we are, midnight, looking at that naked strong mark inside the corner of Temple Street. Same sort of thing, like, what? There's a demand for this land. The fact that people wouldn't make their decisions and try to provide something that the community needs and that could make them money just boggles the mind.
All right, but it's not all bad news. We do have some new parking options. So the first is what we're calling the Homans Lot. You may remember the building that was demolished on Medford Street near School Street. The MBTA has been kind enough to construct us a 20-space parking lot, and it's been signed for City Hall and school permits only. It's open now. I believe Monday is going to be the first day where the Green Line contractors won't be able to park there anymore. It's unregulated overnight, so it would be open to residents overnight. It's about a 5-minute walk to campus up School Street. Yeah, and that parking lot is active.
Can you flip back to the map, Justin, and just kind
Yep.
of point that out? Most of us probably know that location. It's worth effort for any further information.
Actually, it's on your map, isn't it?
Sorry.
It's all right. So that is right here. So
Right next
that's
to the mobile station, corner of school.
right next to the mobile station. So that's a walk up school. It's about a 5-minute walk from there.
And in the longer term, just so folks know, the city retains ownership of that property. The MBTA is using it under a license agreement with us to make the Green Line cheaper, safer, faster. But ultimately, when they finish, they will vacate that site and it will be available to the city for all of the various public policy goals that we have, through open space, affordable housing, workforce development, and parking is always part of that kind of equation, that thought process that we've gone through.
Yeah. Another area that we'll talk about is the parking area next to Foss Park on Broadway. Think about Broadway, there's sort of that little area where you can pull off on Broadway. It is, got a map here, right up here in front of Foss Park at McGrath. So that is a space that is signed for 2-hour except by permit. So it's permit parking. And we've worked with the traffic department to honor the city hall and school permits. So resident permits, city hall, school permits, those will all be valid there in that area. It's about a 15-minute walk to campus. There's a blue bike station, a couple-minute walk away, and then ride hailing, of course, is an option there.
And it's worth pointing out, we're in the process of putting dedicated bus lanes on that stretch of Broadway.
Yes.
So Route 89 or Route 101 service will become more reliable and will kind of keep congestion. Average riders are going to save 5 or 6 minutes. And so, again, not everybody is going to be willing or able to walk 15 minutes. We're very respectful of that.
Yeah.
Yet for those who are interested in that fresh air, they'll have the option of catching out 89 or 101 up to school, for example, and then get up the hill.
Yeah.
It's all solutions, we've just gone on to a strategy for us here.
Especially for those constrained conditions on days where you know it's going to be really tight. Some folks might prefer to, rather than spend 10 minutes looking for parking, park there initially, and that's 2/3 of your walk to campus. Yeah.
A time question, do you know when those bus lanes will be going that Broadway?
Yeah, again, Justin and I have been out
We
this
got
week,
paint
and
lines.
this week, doing the spray paints and measurements, the final markings will start, but knock on wood, good weather next week. So I would estimate that in a month from now, those things are going to be bright red and functional, and riders will be reaping the benefits of better bus mobility.
Yeah.
This will also have a side benefit of reducing traffic as more and more people realize that they don't have to drive to the top of Winter Hill.
Right.
Park on Mount Vernon Street, or Hockey Orange Line, and Sullivan Square. Have to blame them today if the bus is only on time 60% of the time.
Yeah, and it's worth noting those bus lanes are 24 hours, so it's not a peak only, they'll be in place all day. And then the other option, so the 90 Washington Street lot that was used last June or last May and June, it's no longer available. It was not used. Well,
I'm just saying, I object to that because we were told it was not available at the high school. So I don't know who the 10 cars were, but they were not high school.
so we had the traffic department go out and do some enforcement there. Every time they were there, they checked to see what the permits are. And there were about 10 city hall or school, could have been all city hall permits parking there. So we are replacing those with spaces on New Washington Street. Down here, so here's the 90 Washington Street lot. And these were formerly unregulated spaces along New Washington Street. It is actually about an 18-minute walk to campus. The Bridge Hopper shuttle, the shuttle to get you around the fact that the underpass is closed there, the stop is actually right there, and that'll get you about 2/3 of the way to campus. The number 90 bus is a short walk away, and ride hailing, of course, is an option from there as well. And there's a blue bike station over there. Yes. So we're going to keep monitoring to see if people are using these 10 spaces. Same thing with the Foss Park parking area. Of course, with the resident parking permit, we have no way of telling if those folks are employees of the city or school, but we'll keep an eye out for the specific city hall and school permits. And this is a map that we've made to help people sort of figure out the different transportation options. We've highlighted an 8 to 12-minute walk around campus. The reason for that estimate is because it depends on the exact shape of the streets, how long it takes to walk there. Got the Foss Park parking area just outside the circle. The new Washington Street parking area over here. 80 and 90 bus routes, those are the most direct bus routes to campus. And also the Blue Bike station. And we're hoping to distribute this to teachers and City Hall staff, yeah.
So after our meeting, the working group meeting last week, I spoke with some people who are at the high school doing some, work in their classrooms, and
Yeah.
some of the people live in Dedham and Westwood or whatever, and so what they said to me was, I know how to drive to the lot that I parked in.
Yeah.
They said, School Street's a one-way coming up. They said, they don't even know what street is School Street. They don't know that Walnut's one-way going down. They don't know that Montrose goes one way. They don't know any of it. So
Okay.
whatever communication Susanna is supposed to send out, which was my question.
Yeah.
I'm so confused about whether she's sending that out like Monday.
I'm not sure when they're going to send it out. They showed me some language today.
Okay.
Yeah.
There's gonna have to be a fair amount of work done to educate the people who need to drive the most.
Yeah.
Who genuinely do not know, they get to Highland Ave and then it's, oh, I can't get on that, I can't get on that.
Yeah.
So, there's gonna be a little bit more.
Now, again, that was a super helpful point, Lisa, thank you, and we can update this, just as GIS whiz, so we can make computer maps, so we can add in some of the things like the one-way prohibitions, where the traffic signals are, so that people kind of have a little bit more of that user manual.
Yeah. So parking regulations on Highland itself. So during construction, one of our goals is to discourage contractors from parking there. It's in the project agreement that they're supposed to park off-site in the area under I-93 and be shuttled to the site. Also a goal to provide accessible access to the library, specifically accessible parking spaces. So previously, the parking area sort of right in front of City Hall and the high school on Highland Ave was 2-hour parking except by permit. It was not a tow zone. So that meant that you got a ticket, but you weren't necessarily towed. And what we learned over time is that the ticketing was not a good deterrent for the contractors because someone was looking out for them and helping them pay those tickets. And there also was 2 accessible parking spaces in the lot off Medford Street, a lot that's now closed. So the parking department has updated the regulations. You'll notice the signs are now red. That means that it is also a tow zone. It's still 2-hour parking except by permit. They've moved the accessible parking spaces right to the corner of Walnut and Highland. So they're right here in front of the library. And some people ask about what the process is, how would someone get towed? So if you see someone that's parked there that shouldn't be parked there, you can call 311 to report it. A parking control officer would come out and issue a ticket if they found that to be the case. And then to actually have the vehicle towed, a police officer has to be present to see it. So there's often a bit of a time delay, and it's dependent on whether they have resources to send somebody at that time. We're in conversations about whether we can use the school resource officer in that role. And then just the fact that over the summer they haven't been towing vehicles, but once school begins, that enforcement's going to be ramping up.
Will that start Monday or the days first?
So the signage for all the school lots is September to June, so it's really going to start in earnest on September 3rd. I believe you'll see people towed until that date.
There's still gonna be cars in the School Street lot and on the street.
They'll receive tickets. We'll have to talk to the parking department to see if they can enforce that full week. Yeah.
That's the big problem.
Okay. So, new mobility options, sorry. So even if you have to drive to get around, the more that we can get folks riding bikes, taking the bus, the more that we can get people on these other options, the more parking spaces there are available for everybody else. So one thing we're looking at is Blue Bike's bike share. I was talking to the Blue Bikes folks, and there's only 11 City Hall or school employees that are currently signed up for the discounted membership. So City Hall and school employees get a $60 membership. That's for an entire year, unlimited 45-minute trips. And we were a little surprised to learn that only 11 people were taking advantage of that. So one of the things we're looking at is whether we can, anybody, yeah, 3 of them are in this room, right? So we're looking at whether we can reduce the cost of that, or maybe just promoting it better so that more people can sign up. $60 for a whole year is really, it's a pretty good deal. And we're also looking at whether we can add more docks to the station at City Hall. Because one of our concerns is if we get a bunch of new Blue Bikes members, we have to make sure that there are bikes available for them to use. I was talking to somebody in the athletic department at the school, and she mentioned that she was bringing her bike in her car so that she could leave her car in the parking space, not have to move it, and use a bike to get around to the different schools in the city. So we're not just looking at whether people can use that to get to campus. It's a pretty good option for getting around to the different places in the city, because a lot of them now have Blue Bike stations installed. There's also the number 90 bus. I know people think of the number 90 bus as the one that never comes, but there's some exciting improvements happening to the 90 starting September 1st. This is a part of the MBTA's Better Bus project. So they were looking at revenue neutral improvements to the bus system. So not spending more money, but using the money they have in a more efficient way. And what they've done with the 90 bus is it's going to end at Assembly Square instead of going to Wellington. And because it sits in a lot of traffic in that trip from Assembly to Wellington, that allows the T to run a lot more buses for the same amount of money. The schedule hasn't come out yet, but our back of the envelope estimate is about maybe a third more trips, 30% more trips. So it could mean half-hour frequency during peak hours instead of more like 45 minutes an hour. And that's a pretty good crosstown bus, Davis to Leechmere. It's pretty popular, but the frequency is an issue.
Connections to the Somerville Community School, Capilano, the library on the east side. It's a super important and kind of underperforming bus route as far as everyday bus routes in Somerville go. And it's also worth pointing out, that was the brainchild of Mike, who was our project manager, many of you knew, because he was working with you and listening. He came up with this scheme. We floated it to the MBTA. They kind of, pushback would be the wrong term, but they had to kind of validate this proposal that Mike came up with. And because of our advocacy, we were able to get them to implement that change. It doesn't come easy, right? Bus routes kind of get cast in the amber of the same ones that we had 30, 40, 50 years ago. It's incredible. And the fact that we did able to achieve this modest change, it's a small thing. It's another part of that whole kind of mosaic of solutions.
Yeah. I live on the 90 route, and I know I'd love to take it a lot more than I currently do, but just having to wait so long for it to come. So one other piece is Brad touched on the Central Broadway bus lanes. So the 89 and the 101 bus, like you mentioned, are going to have their own lanes for nearly the length of Broadway from Lagoon Square to McGrath Highway. So we're hoping that'll speed up the service a lot. If the T is able to make the buses run faster, they can run more buses at the same cost. And if you'd like more information on that, there's a website set up. You can review the plans. There also are going to be separated bicycle lanes as a part of that project in the uphill directions over Winter Hill. So we're hoping that makes it a little easier to get over the hill on bicycle from the other side of Somerville. All right. One other thing I wanted to touch on is the city's Neighborways for walking and biking. So one of the things that we hear a lot is that Highland Ave is not a comfortable place to bike, especially. So these are alternative low-stress routes that are using neighborhood streets. In some cases, they allow the bikes to go in the opposite direction of traffic. And these are really, really low-volume streets. We're talking 400 cars a day. So that's really one every couple of minutes.
By comparison, it's 12,000 cars per day.
Yeah. And because the one-ways face different directions, cars don't use it as a through movement. And if you allow bicycles to use it as a through movement, it becomes really attractive because you can bike across Somerville and you might not even get passed by a car at all. So they sort of parallel Highland Ave. There's one in East Somerville as well. And we just want to promote this as an alternative for getting to the high school that people may not know about. You may not know about it because they're only really marked by the painted curb extensions you might see on the corners. But this fall, we're going to be coming out with Wayfinding Signs. And these signs are going to tell you exactly how far it is to walk to different destinations around the city. City Hall and the high school are one of the highlighted destinations. So at essentially each intersection facing in all directions, there'll be a sign like this telling you, take this route and how far it'll be.
And I know that we're well represented in terms of kind of core neighborhood around the hill today. but for folks like Ronnie and Lisa and you, Kate, people who have connections, professional, social on the east side of Somerville, we know that McGrath is an understandable barrier for walking and biking to get to the campus. The east side route, if you don't know it, that Justin's pointing out, gets you to the Gilman Street underpass, so you can actually get from the back or from the east over to the library and City Hall and then the high school without having to cross at Pearl Street or Broadway, or God forbid, at Bedford Street and Greenville and all that. So we're really excited about that. And this signage package that Justin's describing is an important part of getting the word out to more users. But again, we're going to count on you as ambassadors and kind of conduits of information. Compliment the rest of the city's practices to get the word out about that route.
I didn't ride these for a long time, and I actually live on Gilman Street, and the first time you ride this one along Highland, it's shockingly comfortable from a bicycle perspective because you just don't interface with cars very often.
I literally feel my blood pressure drop
Yeah.
the moment I turn on the Gilman Street when I get out the immediate path.
Yeah. So this isn't specific infrastructure for bikes, but it's a way of using our street network to make it more efficient for bicycles. All right. So we're also looking at a couple other options, none of which we're ready to sort of implement right now. One option is zip card counts and vehicles for municipal employees. One thing that we've heard is that there are a couple of employees of City Hall and also the school that have to take around equipment to different schools in the area. This would allow those people to not have to use their personal cars if they have an option to leave their car at home. Zip cars are rented by the hour or by the day, and it's one option to sort of offer another way for example, like I brought this equipment here tonight. I had to go home and get my car and bring it over here. You know, the zip car means that I can just leave my car at home and shuttle things over here. One other option is emergency ride home. Anyone familiar with an emergency ride home program? So the point of emergency ride home is to make it easier to try out something like walking, biking, or taking the T. Something that we hear a lot from people, especially those that don't live close to campus, is that they can't try out these options because what if I have to go pick up my child? Or what if there's an emergency, right? What if I have to go home for an unexpected reason or for a childcare reason? So what Emergency Ride Home does is it offers ways to get a guaranteed ride home, whether that's via an Uber or Lyft or some other ride share. When this kind of program first debuted, it was done through taxi vouchers. It's basically to just lower the barrier to trying things out. Yeah.
And we force private developers to do this stuff.
Right.
Assembly Square, Union Square, when big development comes in, we're realizing that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And we actually kind of regulate the new developers and the new employers, say you have to offer your employees these types of services. And, you know, to be perfectly blunt, our city needs to treat our workforce the same way that we force Partners Healthcare to treat its workforce the same. So this is emerging best practices, and we're excited to turn the corner and use the high school and the after project to try to accelerate our evolution here.
Yeah. And again, none of this is aimed directly at people that have to drive to get here, but the fewer people that have to do that, the more room there is for everybody else. And that's really what this is all about. We know we have limited capacity, so we need to prioritize who has access to that capacity. And the last strategy we're looking at is whether we can do a partial subsidy or a partial reimbursement for parking or ride-hail expenses on those constrained days. So we're talking about second and fourth Mondays, those days when we know 2 times a month it's going to be very tight. Trying to see whether we can set up some kind of program to offer expenses so that if folks need to park on the other side of Somerville or find parking in a private lot like at Assembly Square, that we can help sort of offset some of that expense. And lastly, our next steps. So we are very actively pursuing license agreements for additional off-site, off-street parking. We need to monitor the usage of Homans to see how much it's being used, how much the Foss Park parking area is being used, how much the new Washington Street parking area is being used. We need to get going on some of those other strategies that we talked about, like the zip car, like the emergency ride home. We're also looking at whether we can adjust the street sweeping schedule. We talked about how there's that overlapping regulation, the Monday mornings 12 to 6 and then 8 to 12. It's a little difficult because there are spillover effects. Basically every night something is getting swept. So we're trying to see, can we swap with another arterial without creating some of those spillover effects. And then the last thing we want to focus on is a staff survey of actual trip data. So we have the survey where we ask people how they usually get to campus, how they plan on getting to campus. But we want to do a different style of survey where it is 1 week of travel. How did you travel every day? And that way, that'll enable us to come up with a real sort of percentage of people that are driving alone or that are walking or biking, taking the T. And we can get a little more of an idea of like what are the most popular strategies for getting people not to drive. So one question could be, you know, when you drive, why? And we can list a bunch of examples when you don't drive, when you walk or carpool, why? So we're hoping to debut that this fall with the staff. Lastly, you can get all the background documents, presentations, and a comment form at that website. And you'll add your email to our list. And with that, we open it up for discussion. Questions, comments? Yeah.
Will there still be some type of small concourse that will lead, I know the high school needs 5 handicap spots, and
Mhm.
there should be a food for City Hall, so how,
Yeah.
where's that gonna be?
So this is the post-high school construction before the next phase of Central Hill happens. So not renovating the buildings over here. And the high school had spaces over on Medford Street. I believe most, if not all, of those spaces are the handicap parking spaces. There's the spaces along the concourse here. And I believe there's at least 2 additional handicap spaces that'll be there. So those.
Library, will there be any handicap spaces at the library?
So I believe the plan is that the handicap space for the library will actually be over here because the distance is a little too far. It's not an accessible entry from this parking lot. There's no accessible path.
Yeah, there will be
Yeah.